Hola amigos, Stuart here from Spain Speaks. Today coming to you from the centre of Portugal with this fantastic castle in the background, and we also have the Tagus River down below, and I'm going to do a comparative video between Spain and Portugal. For those that are maybe deciding to come and live in the south of Europe and you're throwing up the two options, maybe Portugal, maybe Spain, I'm going to give my 20 cents worth on some of the key factors that you should take into consideration if you are thinking of coming and living in either of the two countries. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is cost of living, and I'm going to say that Portugal is a fraction cheaper than Spain when it comes to cost of living. There are some things here that are more expensive, there are some things that are cheaper. So for example, if you go out to a restaurant, if you go out and have a drink, it's cheaper in Portugal to do that. It's also cheaper to get a cup of coffee and a snack, and some other costs are cheaper. However, when it comes to consumer products like shower gel, shampoo, toothpaste and things like that, Portugal is a lot more expensive than Spain, and it's also more expensive when it comes to filling up your car at the Bowser. Fuel costs here are a lot more than they are in Spain. In fact, a lot of people from Portugal that live close to the border cross it to get fuel because they want to save a few pennies. So that's something that you need to keep in mind as well. Other costs are more or less on par. Of course, if you're in the big cities like Lisbon, Porto, or the big cities in Spain like Madrid, Barcelona, Seville, Valencia, for example, you're not going to notice a lot of difference in cost of living. Now, the cost of living in Portugal is cheaper, but then again, salaries are lower. Now, if you are retired, you probably don't care, but if you're going to be working, you'd have to keep that in mind as well. In both countries nowadays, 1,000 euros is considered a good salary. A lot of young people, that's all they're going to make, and some people are making less than 1,000 euros a month, so keep that in mind. The minimum salary in Portugal is about 600 euros a month. The minimum salary in Spain, I think at the moment, is up around 900. Obviously, you don't want to be making the minimum salary if you're going to come here and work, but as a guide to go on, about 600 in Portugal, that's 14 payments, and about 900 in Spain, maybe 1,000, I'm not sure. They did put it up recently, I'm not sure what it's at the moment. It's about 900, I think, and that's also the 14 payments of the minimum salary. But as I said, a lot of people are making around 1,000 euros a month in both countries, so salaries not that great. But Portugal, from a cost of living point of view, a little bit lower. And if you're not living in one of the big cities, so if you're living north of Lisbon or in the centre, in this area here, for example, you're not going to be paying a huge amount of money for rent. So, but you're also going to have trouble to get a job in a place like this as well, so keep that in mind. And the other thing that we've got here is that in Portugal you're going to be paying 23% VAT, in Spain it's 21%, so the government's got their hand in your pocket when it comes to those types of taxes, the consumer taxes, let's say, the VAT or the IVA. Now, the next thing I'll talk about is security, and in my opinion, both countries, Spain and Portugal, are safe countries to live in. There's not a huge amount of violence. Of course, there is street crime. People do get their houses robbed. You can get your car stolen. You can get your car broken into. You can get your wallet pinched. You can get your bag snatched. All of those things that happen in European cities happen here as well. And if you are in the big cities, Madrid, Barcelona, living that is, Lisbon, Porto, you have to be careful with street crime. But from a general security point of view, I find both countries really safe. If you've got kids, I can't recommend both countries more highly. Children are treated really, really well. Safe countries for children to grow up in. There is a terrorism aspect, of course. Spain has had its terrorist attacks throughout the years. They had the problem with the Basque terrorist group in the past. In the last few years, there's been problems with Islamic terrorism in Spain. There have been a couple of attacks, so you've got to keep that in mind as well, mainly in big cities. Portugal, I don't think, has had a major terrorist attack ever. I could be wrong, but I can't think of one off the top of my head. But touch wood, and I'll say that again, touch wood, that it doesn't happen, but you never know, because everywhere in Europe at the moment there is that risk, unfortunately. In both countries, there's no gun crime, okay? So it's not like in the USA where there's a problem with guns. The cities are safe in that regard as well. No gun culture in either of the two countries. I'm not going to say that people haven't been shot in the past, of course. Hunters have guns, policemen have guns, and there have been cases where policemen have gone crazy and shot people, but it doesn't happen all the time. But it's not out of control like it is in some other places in the world. So from a security point of view, can only recommend both countries highly in that regard. And as I said, crime does exist, but it's not rampant crime. And there's also not a lot of crime related to alcoholism, not a lot of violence related to alcoholism. You don't get violence at pubs, you don't get a lot of violence at clubs. You can walk into bars and restaurants and people are not aggressive. So that's a pro for these countries as well. Now the next thing I'll talk about is getting around from a transport point of view, but we'll do that in a different location. So let's go. Now another thing I'll talk about is getting around the two countries, and I'll say that in both countries you have very good road systems. However, as I mentioned previously, in Portugal you're going to have to pay for the privilege of driving around, whereas in Spain not so much. So Spain obviously is better from that point of view. Portuguese drivers are also crazy. You think Spanish drivers are crazy? Drive in a city like Lisbon or on some of the other roads here. People really take their lives into their own hands when they're driving. They drive fast, sometimes they're reckless, and when it comes to overtaking, they take a lot of risks. Not as many as they did 20 or 30 years ago, but still be careful driving in this country. Now the train system in Spain is a lot better than it is here. In Spain you've got the fast train. There's no fast trains in Portugal. In fact, if you catch some trains in Portugal, you might be lucky to get to your destination. That also happens in Spain in some of the more underdeveloped areas like Extremadura, for example. They have problems with the train system, but the rest of Spain has a fantastic rail network, and as I said, you can get around really quickly on fast trains to most of the capital cities. From Madrid you can get to Barcelona, to Seville, to Cordoba, to Malaga, to Granada, to a lot of places quickly on the fast train, but in Portugal no. So that is another thing to keep in mind. Portugal's neglected its infrastructure over the last few decades, and you can notice that in the train system. Portugal is smaller than Spain, so in that sense it's more manageable. One of the problems with Spain is the size, a lot more mountainous regions, and a lot more difficult to get around. So Portugal from that point of view more manageable, easier to get around east to west, north to south. However, as I said, you're going to have to pay for it if you are driving. So that is that aspect of the two countries. Now the next thing I'll talk about is stability from an economy point of view, and both countries are a little bit up and down when it comes to the economy and the stability of their economies. Unemployment goes up and then unemployment goes down. Portugal at the moment is in the middle of an economic boom. Spain's economy is also a lot better than it was a few years ago, but remember that both economies 5 or 6 years ago touched rock bottom. A lot of people had to leave Portugal to go and find jobs in other countries. A lot of people had to leave Spain to go and find jobs in other countries as well. Now again, if you're retired, that shouldn't really affect you, but if you're coming here to look for a job and you're not going to teach English, for example, which is a fairly stable job if you want to get into the Spanish or the Portuguese economy, be warned that the economies can go up and down like a yo-yo. And another thing I'll mention is that both countries have a lot of debt. I don't know the exact figures, but I think in the case of Portugal it's 100% of GDP, and Spain is up there around that figure as well. So there's a lot of debt that still needs to be paid off to the creditors because of the crisis over the last decade or so. Both economies have really big states and they suck up a lot of the resources. There's a lot of old people in Spain, a lot of old people in Portugal. Not a lot of young people, unfortunately, and a lot of the young people have gone to work in other countries. So that means the state has to pay a lot of money in pensions every month because these are state-run pension systems. In Spain, the system apparently is almost broke. Probably is in Portugal as well, and a lot of money that they have to pay. And this means that a lot of money is not there for spending on other things, so keep that in mind. So that's Spain and Portugal from an economy point of view. Now, the next thing I'll talk about is culture and traditions, and I'll say that both countries have very strong cultures and very strong traditions. Spain is a real mix of cultures and a real mix of traditions, and that also makes it complicated from a political point of view. You can see that in the last few years, Catalonia has wanted to separate from Spain, the Basque country has wanted more independence, and there's other independence movements all throughout Spain. So it makes it a little bit complicated from that point of view. There's 17 autonomous communities in Spain, and a lot of them have different laws, rules and regulations, not to mention the different languages in Spain. There's 4 languages in Spain, of course. You've got Castellano, you've got Gallego, you've got Catalan, and you've got Basque. And then you've got other languages like Valencian, for example. Portugal, the good news is that there's only one language, so it's fairly simple in that regard. Obviously, there's going to be a little bit of variation between the north and the south and the east and the west, for example, but in general, people speak the same language. And that's a thing that I'll mention, is that in Portugal, people seem to be on the same page. In Spain, nobody's on the same page. The Catalans want something, the Basques want something else, the Andalus people want something else. Everybody seems to want something from Spain. But I don't sense that in Portugal. And as I said, Spain has its rebellious regions. Both cultures go a long way back. You can't really define a single Spanish culture, and the Portuguese culture as well. They go way back, and they're very set in their ways with regard to a lot of things, and not easy to change. But then again, you don't want these things to change, because that's what makes Portugal Portugal, and that's what makes Spain Spain. So from a culture and tradition point of view, both countries fairly strong in that regard. Now, I'm nearly on the border with Spain here. I'm in the middle of the Alentejano region in Portugal, so I'll cross the border now and I'll finish that video off there. Let's go. Now, I'm back in Spain now, and I'll finish this video off. I'm in one of my favorite parts of Spain, which is the province of Cáceres, and behind me here we have the city of Malpartida de Plasencia, about 250 kilometers west of Madrid. And I'll finish off by talking about the people in both countries. Now, of course, it's difficult to generalize, but I find that people in both countries are friendly. They have a live and let live attitude, and as long as you're not in their face, they're not going to be in your face. There's a lot of stereotypes that the Spanish are loud. Somebody said in a comment the other day that Spanish people are more euphoric, and you generally do get that impression here in Spain. It depends on where you go, of course, but Spanish people do tend to be louder than the Portuguese. This person also said that he finds the Portuguese more melancholic, sadder group of people. That's a generalization, of course, and I don't think everybody in Portugal is sad and melancholic, but you can also get that impression because it is hard to crack a smile from the Portuguese, or at least that has been my experience over the years. But once you get to know them, once they get to know you, they are, of course, a friendly mob. In Portugal, I also find people to be a little bit more polite than in Spain, but that's just me, of course, except when they're driving. And I mentioned this earlier in the video that Portuguese people, when they drive, they can become a little bit aggressive on the roads. But hey, to sum up, in general, people are friendly, and as I said, they're not in your face. So that is a definite pro in both countries. So I'll start to wrap this comparative video up on Spain and Portugal. A lot of people tend to think that both countries are similar, but the deeper you dig, that is not the case. Of course, everything I mentioned in the video are just my opinions from my experience of living in Spain for the last 20 years, and of course having spent a lot of time in Portugal over the last 10 to 12 years. So feel free to leave your questions and comments and opinions in the section below. Give the video a thumbs up if you liked it. I'll see you in the next video. Hasta luego. Hasta luego.